Harry Hill, Tim the Tiny Horse, Tim and the Disappearing Hula Hoop. Tim the Tiny Horse was tiny, but cheerful. Here he is playing with a two-pence piece, so you get the idea. A sugar lump would last him a month. His stable was a matchbox, with an old tic-tac box for conservatory. You know, somewhere for Tim to chill out. One fine day, Tim the Tiny Horse went to get his hula hoop for lunch. It was barbecue-flavoured one that he'd saved from a party. But to his horror, it had gone. Sniff, sniff. Only a slight whiff of barbecue sauce lingered where once was Tim's hula hoop. Disappointed, he wandered home, still hungry. On the way back, what do you think he saw? That's right, a fly munching into his very own hula hoop. A fight followed. First, Tim seemed to be winning. Then, the fly seemed to gain the upper hand. But after about a minute, they'd both had enough, and agreed to share it. Later on, they sat down and watched a video together. Well, there are no real winners in a fight, are there? Tim gets the showbiz bug. Tim the Tiny Horse was so small that the blacksmiths had to make his shoes from paper clips. His saddle was made from a watch strap, which is why he never wore it. Well, would you? He was small, but he still had standards. Most of his activities were severely restricted, so he spent much of his time lazing in the sun or watching TV. One day, Tim the Tiny Horse sat on the patio watching the ants go about their business. He admired their sense of purpose. I need to get a job, he thought. That lunchtime, as Tim sat on the couch watching Anna Ford on the 1 o'clock news of BBC, he realised that everyone on TV was small, just like him. It was perfect for him. Maybe he could be in a cowboy film, or the Horse of the Year show, or even read the lunchtime news with Anna. Maybe he'd meet that special lady horse he'd always been looking for. He knew he shouldn't get his hopes up, as from what he'd seen, most of the TV shows on TV were set in a pub. And he didn't like pubs, because often there was a dog in there. If there was one thing Tim didn't like, it was dogs. Likes, Anna Ford, hula hoops, sweets, fly, dislikes, dogs. Without further ado, Tim the Tiny Horse set off for the TV studio. When he arrived at the studio, everything was much bigger than he'd been led to believe. In fact, everything was pretty much full size, including the dog. I'm not sure I want to be part of this, he thought, and instead headed off to the canteen. But a sugar lump. Thought Tim the Tiny Horse. The studios may not be what I'd hoped, but the food is first rate. With that, he headed for home. After all, there's no point getting a job for the sake of it. Fly gets a girlfriend. Tim the Tiny Horse was tiny. He was so small that a pizza leaflet would take him an hour and a half to read. So small was Tim that even the small pizza was too big for him. What a waste of an hour and a half. Not a typical lunch for him. Tim the Tiny Horse was a hula hoop, preferably barbecue beef. One day, Tim's best friend, Fly, announced that he had met a lady fly and that she was now his girlfriend. The upshot of this was that Fly didn't want to see Tim as much. On a couple of occasions, Tim went round to see if Fly wanted to come out to play, only to find that Fly's girlfriend was already there. What does he want? Perhaps you would like to play too, said Tim the Tiny Horse hopefully. I think not, said Fly's new girlfriend, looking at Tim in a way that didn't make him feel particularly welcome. Tail dropping, head held low. Bad expression. Fly explained to Tim over the phone that they could still play together, but Tim should give a little warning before calling round. A short time after that, Fly's girlfriend decided she didn't want to see Fly anymore, although they could still be friends. There were no other flies involved. Whilst Tim was sorry to see Fly so upset, he was secretly pleased that things were back to normal. Tim felt a little bit guilty about this feeling. Then he remembered the look that Fly's ex-girlfriend had given him, and the feeling passed. After all, you've got to stick up with your friends. Tim has a brush with Anna Ford. Tim the Tiny Horse was extremely small. In fact, he was so small that he found it difficult to get served in bars. Fortunately, he had a very loud voice. He didn't always say nay, but when he did, he meant it. Tim mainly drank shots. Flashback to earlier. Likes, Anna Ford, hula hoops, sweets, Fly, dislike dogs, Fly's girlfriend. It's been established, I think, that Tim the Tiny Horse was a great fan of the BBC News at 1 o'clock with Anna Ford. He was fascinated by Anna, and every photograph of her appeared in the newspapers. He would cut it out and stick it in his scrapbook. Once he wrote to Anna Ford for her autograph. After many weeks, a lovely photo of Anna arrived, signed, "To Tim, good luck, Anna Ford." Tim the Tiny Horse pasted it onto his bedroom wall. He called it her Anna Ford mural. Tim wrote back to Anna asking whether it would be possible for the two of them to meet up. A polite letter of refusal came by return of post. It had been written not by Anna, but by somebody who worked with her. For 2 weeks, Tim watched the lunchtime news on 12:30 on ITV. Then he went back to Anna. Well, it doesn't do to bear a grudge, does it? Tim and Fly go out. Tim the Tiny Horse was, well, very small. To Tim, a conker was a major obstacle. A crinkle in a piece of paper was a real hurdle. One day, Tim and his friend Fly decided to go to town. They set off with Fly riding on Tim's back. What an adventure, thought Tim the Tiny Horse. I could buy a chair. And I could buy some shoes, said Fly out loud. Then Tim remembered that most chairs were far too big for him. And Fly remembered that most shoes came in sets of 2 rather than 6. Is this trip entirely necessary, said Tim the Tiny Horse. After all, we don't really need anything from town. Yes, said Fly, and the town is an awfully long way. The answer was obvious, no. With that, they headed home. This time, it was Tim's turn to ride on the back of Fly. Sometimes you're better off just staying in. Tim and Fly consider the meaning of life. Tim the Tiny Horse and his best friend Fly were in the park, staring at the clouds and chatting. I wonder if there is such a thing as God, said Fly. I should think so, said Tim the Tiny Horse. What about all the bad things that happen in the world? Like war, earthquakes and famine, said Fly. Well, we've all done things we're not proud of, said Tim, and he started to think about the great pea eaten off the floor in the supermarket without paying for it. And at that point the sun came out. Draw your own conclusion from that, he said, pointing to the sky. Fly looked rather sheepish. Sometimes you have to see the bigger picture. Tim the Tiny Horse logs on. Tim the Tiny Horse was exceedingly small. In fact, given a cocktail stick, a piece of cotton, and a hawthorn berry, Tim could play swing ball. Lolly stick, saw here, having formed a bat from a discarded lolly stick. Tim often played his best friend Fly at swing ball, but rarely won, as Fly would often play the ball high. Fly had been going on about his sister had been learning at school about the internet and how fantastic it was. You can look up anything you want and find out all about it, said Fly. So one day, Tim the Tiny Horse trotted off to the internet cafe to log on. However, when he got there, he couldn't think of anything to look up. So he looked up himself. The internet then told him all about a tortoise called Tim, who lived to be 160 years old, but was now dead. Tim thought about what it would be like to be 160 and shuddered. As he trotted home, he thought about his experience at the internet cafe, and resented the way the internet had made him think about something he hadn't really wanted to confront yet: aging and his own mortality. On top of that, when he arrived home, there was a note on Tim's door from Fly. Tim, I called round, but you were out. Yours, Fly. Saying that he'd called round to see if Tim wanted to play, but Tim had been out. It seemed the internet wasn't as fantastic as Tim had been led to believe. Author's note: Tim always lies on his back when particularly frustrated. Tim does some cooking. Tim the Tiny Horse was by no means a large horse, but what he lacked in the stature department, he more than made up for in enthusiasm. For instance, Tim was far too small to take part in the London Marathon. All these pounding feet would pose a real danger to him. But that didn't stop him enjoying it on the television. One day, Tim the Tiny Horse came upon the discarded wrapper of a fudge bar. On closer inspection, Tim realised that there was a list of ingredients. The fools, thought Tim the Tiny Horse. There's nothing to stop people from making their own fudge bars. Back in his kitchen, he set about making his first fudge bar. Let's see what I need, he said, reading the list of ingredients. Sugar, I've got that. Chocolate, I've got that. But what is non-hydrogenated vegetable fat? He thought. Best leave it to the experts. And he ate the sugar. Munch, and the chocolate. And with a little imagination, it tasted a bit like fudge. Tim goes for a job in the radio. Tim the Tiny Horse was, I'm afraid to say, a little on the small side. For instance, he was to eat a whole Malteser, it might take him a whole morning, and he would get a headache and have to spend the afternoon in bed. A tube of toothpaste would last him. Well, he'd been at the same tube for 3 years, and there was still only a slight dent in it. Tim was small, but ambitious. One afternoon, after the news at 1 o'clock with Anna Ford, Tim sat listening to the cricket on the radio. Suddenly, it dawned on him. Radio would be perfect for me, he said out loud. On the radio, it's all in the voice. It doesn't matter how big you are. His best friend Fly told him that what he needed to do was make a demo tape of his voice and send it to the people who ran the radio. Demo, it seems, was short for demonstration. Then Tim unearthed an old tape recorder. I'll be the producer, said Fly, and presented the record button. Unfortunately, when put on the spot, Tim the Tiny Horse couldn't think of anything to say. Hello. All he could manage was hello. To spare Tim any embarrassment, Fly told him there was a technical fault with the tape. They agreed that the radio was much harder than it looked. Much easier just to listen to it. Tim finds out that he is a winner. Tim the Tiny Horse was not just small, but, well, tiny. As they say, there's a clue in the name. He was so small, he would use a bottle top as a hot tub. He had to use a cotton bud to scrub his back. One night, just after running his bath, the phone rang. It was a strange man who told him that he had won a prize. The man explained that Tim may have won a car, a holiday, or cash. Immediately, Tim's mind began to race. Clearly, a car was no good for him, as his feet wouldn't be able to reach the pedals. Even if it was the car, he could always sell it and take the cash. But a holiday or money. The strange man went on to explain that, in fact, he had not won the prize yet, but he would be put into a prize draw. This scared Tim, as he had once become trapped in a chest of drawers as a fool. At this point, Tim looked over at the lovely hot steaming bath. If he left it much longer, it would start to get cold. I think I'll give it a miss, said Tim the Tiny Horse to the strange man, but good luck with it. Moments later, Tim was having a lovely warm soak. Why do they always phone at bath time, he wondered. Tim faces up to reality. I think we're beginning to get the idea that in the size stakes, Tim the Tiny Horse had very little to offer. No, he had other strengths, optimism, enthusiasm, and interest in current affairs. Particularly when presented by Anna Ford. One night, Tim the Tiny Horse and his best friend Fly sat watching a television program in which there were a number of hidden cameras spying on people living in a house. Not a lot happened. Fly explained to Tim that this was called a reality TV. Reality TV would be perfect for me, said Tim the Tiny Horse, and raced towards a drawer cupboard in search for his camera recorder. Tim set up the camcorder in his front room and filmed everything. He did. The next day, that evening, Tim the Tiny Horse played his reality TV show to Fly. He fell asleep after 5 minutes. Thought Tim the Tiny Horse. Yawn. I think this show should be about 4 minutes long. Sometimes reality is better in small doses. Tim's Christmas. Christmas was always a bit quiet for Tim, being an orphan, and not being a particularly big fan of the Vicar of Dibley. Although loving Dawn French and lots of other things, Fly, on the other hand, spent Christmas with his family. Also, and afford tended to have the day off, which just added to Tim's sense of isolation. At Christmas, Tim the Tiny Horse cooked a chicken nugget, which he ate as part of hot for lunch. Then the rest called over the next few days. Pudding was a fruit pastel. This year, Fly had given Tim a Christmas cracker. A fat lot of good that is, thought Tim the Tiny Horse, looking at the cracker. Then Tim had an idea. He wedged one end of the cracker in the doorway and pulled, and pulled, and pulled, until the cracker snapped. Unfortunately, the door had won. Tim the Tiny Horse was now in quandary. Should he take the door's winnings? I'll take the toy, but leave the joke and hat, he thought. That seemed fair. The toy was a green plastic horse. Tim the Tiny Horse sat on the sofa with the green plastic horse and watched the Vicar of Dibley. And for a moment Tim had an idea of what it would be like to have a mummy. And on top of that, Dawn French reminded him of a slightly fuller Anna Ford. The end.